Well, the land of seven rivers, and as the subtitle says, it's a brief history of India's geography. Now, the reason I wrote about a brief history of India's geography is a very simple one. Usually, histories are written as sequences of political events, but that is not the only way you can think about history. History can be written in many other ways, and in this particular case, the way I have tried to tell the story of India is through a sequence of rise and fall of cities, how our wildlife has changed, how our physical terrain has changed, the genetics of who the Indians are, which tells us many things about us, which is different from what we have conventionally believed, and so on and so forth. So what I've tried to do is to provide another view of how history of India can be told. As you may have noticed, my book is not titled the Brief History of India's Geography. That's the subtitle. The main title of the book is Land of the Seven Rivers. I will pick that up and show you. So it's Land of the Seven Rivers. And the reason I chose this is because the Rig Veda talks quite a lot about Sapta Sindhu. So Land of Seven Rivers is just a transliteration of that. And the Sapta Sindhu was the original homeland of the Bharata tribe, the tribe after which India now called itself. We don't quite know where those seven rivers were. We know that the Saraswati River, which is now dry, was one of those rivers. But it is the earliest geological term relating to India that we know about. So I thought since it was a history of India's geography, it should be named after the oldest geographical term that I could find. And consequently, I've named the book after it. The genesis of idea is really my own interests. While I'm not trained as a historian at all, I'm an economist by profession, but I have been interested in cartography for a long time. I collect old maps. I have done a lot of work on studying cities and so on. So in a sense, this kind of brought together many of both my professional interests and as well as my hobbies. It's a story I've been working on almost unconsciously for a long time, and at some point in time I thought I should put it down. If it interested me, I figured there would be others who might be interested. Well, I mean, as I said, many of these things are things that I'm anyway interested in. So it's not as if I was doing this initially specifically for the purposes of writing a book. But at some point it became, I had collected enough information that I felt that I needed to take it to the next level. So I actually resigned from my job at Deutsche Bank, moved my family back to India for 2.5 years, and effectively traveled all over India. I mean, from Gujarat to the northeast, from Ladakh to the tip of Kerala, and so on, and really traveled all over, collecting information for this book, meeting all kinds of people. And I hope I have been able to do some justice to this subject. I in fact have collected much more material than I have put in the book, but for reasons of readability I had to leave almost 50% of the material I have collected out. But was I influenced by any specific historian? Difficult to say. I've read quite a few, but I must say my favorite historians are not necessarily contemporary ones. I would say my favorites would be people like Ibn Battuta, for example. Now, whether or not I have, my style is influenced by that is difficult to say. But if I had to choose people who I really like reading, they are people like, as I said, Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta and so on. Absolutely, it's not a textbook, absolutely not. And I'm pleased to say that something like 80% of the places mentioned in the book have been visited by me at some point or the other. Many of them during the 2.5 years, but of course, I love traveling, so I've traveled extensively across Southeast Asia, even before I started researching this book. And I went to all kinds of odd places like Zanzibar off the coast of Tanzania to research this. So I did travel around quite a bit, and I have tried throughout the book to give a sense of this, that so-and-so event happened in this place, but today there is something else going on there, or this is what it looks like today. I've tried to give that, sense of it. So yes, I talked about Shah Jahanabad, but then I also talk about contemporary kebabs, which I love eating, and how you can, walk around the old city of Delhi and the atmosphere at night, walking through in front of Kareem's or whatever. Indeed, all of it, because I don't think you can really think about these things separately. So there is, of course, the physical and geological history, which is in fact what this book starts with, about the Indian plate colliding against the Asian plate and pushing up the Himalayas. But of course, there are other ways. Geography is not just about physical geography. There's human geography, there's economic geography, there's cultural geography, and so on and so forth. So my book mixes and matches quite a lot of them. In fact, one of the characters of the book is in fact the wildlife, and particularly lions, which pop up throughout the book. So it's, as I said, it's a brief history of geography, but don't think of this purely in terms of the physical geography. Yes, there are some rivers like the Saraswati River, which play an important part in the story, but it is not exclusively about the physical geography, not at all. Well, I obviously start right in the beginning from the geological processes, but then I actually end with the building of Gurgaon and the rapid urbanization of India. So the last part of the book, the last chapter deals with the current process that we are going through. And in fact, I argue that one of the interesting things that is that we are now living through one of those great periods of change in Indian history, which will leave India being an urban majority country within a generation, and which will change our society, it will change our cultural basis, it will change our politics. So we are in one of those great change periods of Indian history. And while I'm not writing the history of it, but I'm certainly living it. So I have certainly spent quite a lot of time about it, in particularly talking about the new middle class of India that is sort of replacing very rapidly the old middle class from which people like myself are derived. I do talk about climate change. I don't get involved in the controversy of whether or not it's human induced or not. This is not the place to talk about it. But the fact is that climate change has influenced our history quite profoundly over thousands of years. As I mentioned, our coastline as we see it today is not the coastline that was there 8,000–9,000 years ago. And there were major floods. In fact, the Persian Gulf, for example, was above water at the time of the last ice age, and in fact got flooded as recently as 8,000 years ago. And it's very likely that this great flooding of our coastline led to the myths, which in the biblical sense, in the biblical texts is referred to as the great flood of Noah. But in our own text, we have the myth of great floods about Manu and the Matsya avatar and so on, and how Manu then survives this and re-establishes civilization after the flood. So these kinds of legends have at least some of its basis perhaps in these events. And of course, then there is the drying of the Saraswati. We now know that the majority of the Indus, so-called Indus Valley sites are not on the Indus. Some of them are, but most of them are not. And they are on this dried riverbed, which it began drying about 2600 BC, but then completely dried up around 2000 BC and collapsed the Harappan civilization. And the people who lived in this civilization then moved on to the Gangetic Plain or to southern India, and maybe perhaps even some left India, and essentially helped trigger what we now know as Indian civilization. And there's a great deal now of satellite photographs and other data that proves that this drying up of this river was a cataclysmic event in the history of India. And given that we are perhaps living through another major period of climate change, it is a reminder of the frailty of civilization in the face of the wrath of nature. It's quite clear that people have moved in and out of India over very long periods of time. So we are a mixture of all kinds of people who have been mixing in India since the Stone Age. There is a lot of signs that at some point in time, a tribe or a group of tribes moved out from northwestern India westward, possibly as a result of a certain battles being pushed out by the Bharata tribes, and consequently moved into what is now Iran. And there's a great deal of evidence to link the Vedic people with the Avestan people. In fact, you can read Avestan essentially by making a small phonetic change from sir to her. So consequently, as I've argued into the book, the direction of movement was not from Central Asia into India, but quite almost certainly the other way around. And in fact, that's what the genetics now show. And much of this mixing has been influenced incidentally by climate. So for example, the coastline of India has changed over thousands of years, as you know, after the last glacial melt about 8,000 years ago. Much of our coastline moved in some cases by 100 kilometers, which moved out Neolithic people. And so there's been a churn going on in India for long periods of time. And the genetic data is now very clear that whoever we are is a mixture of people who have been mixing for at least since the Neolithic age. There's no sign genetically or otherwise of a bunch of people charging into India on horseback in 1500 BC. I do hope that it is not seen as a textbook. I've tried quite hard to make it approachable, and in fact one could perhaps read it almost as my own journey through my own country and a discovery of it. So I've tried very hard to give it a personal touch and give it a feel of at some points even of a travelogue. So I do hope readers will will find it something that they enjoy reading just for the, irrespective of the subject of it.